Enlightenment class. I'll begin today with the prayer of praise to Shakyamuni Buddha in Tibetan and English. Tempa chendende dejin shepa drachampa yangdapa tsope sanje vipa dang shapsu tempa dewa shepa jitin chempa chebudu e kalo jua lana me pa ladang minam chi tempa sanje chemdende Peljawa Shakya Dupala Shasalo Churu Chapsu Chiwo. Teacher, Bhagawan, Tathagata, Arhat, perfectly pure and complete Buddha, all-knowing, having poise, Sugata, apprehender of the world, navigator of beings to be subdued, incomparable, teacher of gods and humans. To the Buddha, the Bhagawan, glorious conqueror Shakyamuni, we prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. And the refuge in Bodhicitta prayer. Sangichodang sochi cho nam la jangchu badu dani chapsu chi Dai Jin So Je Pe So Nam Ji Drola Pen Chi Sangye Dropa Sho. To the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, I go for refuge until becoming enlightened. Through the merit of my generosity and so on, may I achieve Buddhahood to benefit all beings. To the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, I go for refuge until becoming enlightened. Through the merit of my generosity and so on, may I achieve Buddhahood to benefit all beings. The short mandala offering. O Saji Pochi Juje Beto Rera Lengenye Jenpa Sangye Jendo Mende Oa Drogan Nandaj Chupa Sho. This ground, anointed with perfume and strewn with flowers, Mount Meru, the four continents, adorned with sun and moon, imagined as a Buddha land and offered thus, may all beings enjoy such pure names. And the seven-limbed prayer. I prostrate my three doors with a mind of respect, and offer all actually arranged and mentally emanated offerings. I reveal all the downfalls and negativities that I have ever collected, and rejoice in the virtues of individuals and superiors. Please remain perfectly abiding until samsara is no longer seen. I request you to turn the vast and profound wheels of Dharma. I dedicate the virtues of myself and others to the great enlightenment. And the prayer of the lineage of gurus, which today we will do in English only. Body born from a million magnificent, excellent virtues, speech fulfilling the hopes of infinite beings, a mind that sees all objects of knowledge precisely, I bow my head to the chief among the Shakyas. Supreme sons of the incomparable teacher, carrying the load of all the conqueror's deeds by their emanations appearing in countless realms, I prostrate to Maitreya and Manjushri. The mother of conquerors is difficult to fathom. The precise thought is in commentaries written by Jambu Mipa's ornaments, Nagarjuna and Asanga. I prostrate at the feet of those most renowned in the three realms. From these two great chariots come the excellent lineages of the paths of profound view and vast deeds, their essential points gathered thoroughly and without fault. Prostration to the lamp holding this treasury of instruction. Giving explanation through compassion, by seeing precisely and completely the essential points of all paths of Sutra and Tantra, holder of the conqueror's entire holy Dharma, prostration to the glorious Losangdrugpa. I, seeing all the infinite teachings, supreme way of crossing for those entering the journey's liberation, moved by compassion to deeds skilled in method, prostrations to the spiritual masters who make everything clear. And a great treasury of excellence, Prayer of the Path of Enlightenment in English. The kind master is the basis of all qualities, and proper alliance is the root of the path. By seeing this excellence and through much striving, bestow blessings to be devoted with great respect. This gentle support of freedom obtained this one time is most difficult to achieve. Knowing its great value gives rise to a mind seizing its essence constantly day and night. Bestow blessings to generate this continuum unceasingly. It is like a bubble in water, this constantly moving body and life. Thus remember the swift collapse of death. Beyond death, like body and shadow, white and black karmic results follow after. By gaining firm certainty in this, the mass of faults, subtle and very subtle, are abandoned, and the accomplishment of all virtuous collections completed. Bestow blessings to ever retain conscientiousness. The qualities of samsara are unfit to be trusted, the door to all suffering. Do not be content with these enjoyments. By knowing its defects, bestow blessings to develop a great aspiration for the bliss of liberation. By that pure thought, great conscientiousness is drawn forth, and mindfulness and awareness of the individual liberation, the root of the teachings. Bestow blessings to make this the essential practice. Just as I myself have fallen into samsara's ocean, all living beings as mother are also like that. By seeing the responsibility for the liberation of beings, bestow blessings to be trained in supreme bodhicitta. However, by merely generating the mind, if not acquainted with the three aspects of ethics, enlightenment will not be attained. By seeing this excellence, bestow blessings to train with strong effort in the vows of conqueror silence. Pacifying distraction toward perverse objects, by way of proper analysis of the perfect meaning, bestow blessings to swiftly and continuously generate the path related to the union of calm abiding and special insight. Thus becoming a vessel trained in the common paths, enter the Vajrayana, supreme evolution of all vehicles. Bestow blessings to engage the easy path itself, that sacred way of crossing for fortunate beings. The base of practice for the two aspects of attainment is when guarding the pure vows of commitment is found to be genuine and certain. Bestow blessings to protect them, even at risk of life. Then, by understanding properly the important points, which are the essence of the two stages of the Tantra classes, bestow blessings to practice according to these holy teachings, with continuous effort in the supreme four-session yoga. Like that, may the spiritual friend revealing the gentle path and the friends of proper practice stand firm. Bestow blessings to quickly pacify the masses of outer and inner hindrances. In all rebirths, may I never be parted from perfect gurus in the enjoyment of the glorious Dhamma. By utterly completing all qualities, paths and grounds, may I quickly achieve the state of Vajradhara. So for today's meditation, I thought we'd do meditation on the four immeasurables, and specifically the immeasurable of compassion. And this comes in quite nicely on the subject that we were covering a few weeks back, namely the First Noble Truth. And the First Noble Truth, when it's explained in the context of the medium scope, is mainly explained in terms of developing the mind of renunciation. The logic being that if we gain a clear recognition or understanding of our own situation in psychic existence, then we have a strong wish to do something about it. We have a strong wish to remove psychic existence and its causes. But as Path to Enlightenment also explains, from a great scope perspective, this recognition of the First Noble Truth can also be the cause of our compassion developing. So this is very important in the context of the Mahayana. The more we have an understanding of our situation in psychic existence, of the faults of psychic existence, the more the broader implications of that dawn on us. So we can see it's not just about us. And in fact, if we look at it in context, our own experience of psychic existence is a minuscule part of the whole picture. Yes, as beings in psychic existence, we all go through the experiences of old age, of sickness, of death. We only ever want to go through pleasant experiences and enjoyable experiences. Sometimes, no matter how hard we try, we come across things that we really don't like and that we can't quickly change. And at some point in our lives, we are separated from the people and the things and the situations that give us security, pleasure, and enjoyment so far, and so forth. There are so many things that we'd like to do, so many things we would like to experience and achieve, and it works out sometimes, but it's not going to work out all of the time. But the broader recognition is that it's not just about us, that every other living being, all of the countless other living beings in psychic existence, are in exactly the same position. Our own mother, our own father, our partner, our siblings, our children, absolutely every living being, including those who are really close to us, is faced with exactly the same problem that we are. When someone that we are really close to, that we really love, is going through some really difficult part of their lives, if we could, we would do absolutely everything we could to help them, to change their situation. But actually, we can recall, and again, this isn't a Buddhist fantasy, it isn't a fabrication, that every other living being, without question, is the same as that person, as our mother, our father, in terms of the way they experience their lives from their own side. There's not a jot of difference between their wish for happiness, for our own wish for happiness, and for that of the people who are dearest and closest to us. If we analyse, we can see that to think that they could be any other different from this person who is so precious, so dear to us, that's what's the fantasy. The idea that any one living being's happiness or suffering can be more important than another. So when we generate that sort of mindfulness, it motivates us to develop great compassion and bodhicitta. So as the verse from the Great Treasury of Excellence says, just as I myself have fallen into samsara's ocean, so all living beings as mother are also like that. And if we develop that recognition, then as the next two lines explain, that's the basis of developing bodhicitta. By seeing the responsibility for the liberation of beings, bestow blessings to be trained in supreme bodhicitta. And so the step to doing that is to develop the mind of immeasurable compassion, and we'll now do that reflecting on the 4 points as are explained in the Path to Enlightenment. So first, sitting in meditation posture, making sure Their back is straight and comfortable. Your hands folded in the lap, right hand on the left palm with the thumb tips touching. Arms extended out slightly from the body. Head slightly tilted forward. Eyes half open, half closed. Mouth, jaw and tongue held naturally and relaxed. And take a few moments to develop our mindfulness. Allowing all wandering to the external senses, gather inwards. Also mental wandering towards memories of the past, thoughts about the future. For this short part of our day, allow our attention to rest fully and simply in the present moment. Taking to mind just one object, the natural rise and fall of our breath. First, meditate on the wish of immeasurable compassion. Contemplating how wonderful it would be if all living beings were free of suffering and the cause of suffering. So we don't need to think about whether this could be or how it could be. Just allow ourselves to imagine how wonderful. If I myself never had a moment's worry or suffering again, even better, people who are closest, so dear to me, so familiar to me, who have their worries, their health issues. How wonderful if from this moment they never had a moment's suffering or the cause of suffering. We can bring to mind others, maybe the people we work with. Those that we come across day by day. How wonderful if every one of them, every living being we encountered, from this instant never had a moment's suffering or the cause of suffering. How wonderful if every living being was currently sick, every living being who is currently hungry or thirsty, every living being living under the threat of violence or fear, how wonderful it would be if every single living being, whatever the situation, were free of suffering and the cause of suffering. And then we can meditate on the aspiration of immeasurable compassion, reflecting, may this be so. May every living being be free of suffering and all causes of suffering. So this is a stronger feeling. Not only imagining how wonderful this would be, thinking, may this actually be so. May it come to pass. But everyone who is so close and so dear to us, may they be free of their problems instantly, forever. Also all of those who we don't know, but who we do know from their own side, have no less genuine, live wish for happiness and to avoid suffering. May those who we find difficult, may it come to pass, they are completely free of suffering and the cause of suffering. May every human being everywhere whatever place, whatever background, whatever belief, may they, because they all share the one common thing, never wanting a moment's suffering, may it come to pass that they are completely free of suffering and all causes of suffering. Also all non-human beings. For example, animals who can be so helpless, so vulnerable. May it come to pass that every one of them, without leaving any behind, is free of suffering and all causes of suffering. We then contemplate the pure, superior intention of immeasurable compassion. Thinking, I myself will liberate all living beings from suffering and the cause of suffering. I have the wish of immeasurable compassion, the aspiration of immeasurable compassion. Based on that, step by step, I can expand my positive activities. By practicing according to the guidance of the great holy beings. Ordinary generosity, bringing temporary, limited benefit to a small number of things, can become perfect, extraordinary, transcendent generosity. Bringing huge benefit to limitless beings. my ordinary ethics. Guarding my conduct of body, speech and mind. Can become the perfect ethics of a bodhisattva. Never causing a moment's harm to any being. With every breath we take, only bringing benefit. The ordinary patience we practice with the small difficulties in our lives can become extraordinary, transcendent patience motivated by pure bodhicitta. Giving us the strength and courage to endure any difficulty, to use any difficulty, solely for the benefit of others. Through this, step by step, day by day, improving my mind, day by day becoming closer to enlightenment. I myself can liberate all living beings from suffering and the cause of suffering. To do this, we request the blessing and the inspiration of all holy beings with the prayer of immeasurable compassion. I can practice like this. To free all living beings, everyone without exception, from suffering and the cause of suffering. Mother Tara, the liberator of being. The essence of all Buddha's love. to your power, to your compassion. Please bless and inspire myself and all living beings. To your inspiration, quickly overcome all obstacles to our practice. Quickly develop all of my positive qualities. My kindness, generosity, ethics, patience, energy, great love, great compassion, bodhicitta, pure wisdom, from suffering, and all causes of suffering. Quickly, may they achieve great enlightenment. Again, just setting the scene of the Four Noble Truths being the section of the Path to Enlightenment that we're going through at the moment. The Four Truths being true sufferings, or why any experience of psychic existence ultimately cannot satisfy. That's why it will always be faulty. Why that's the case, why we experience psychic existence the way that we do, what its causes are, the second noble truth, true causes. The fact that it's possible to escape psychic existence by understanding the causes. If we understand the causes and remove them, then we will change the result, the third noble truth of true cessation. And then the actual method or path to do that, to remove the causes of psychic existence, being the fourth noble truth of true paths. So we're going through the second noble truth, true cause, which is explained in chapter 14 of Path to Enlightenment. And the division of the text that we're going through in terms of the outline structure is under a subheading which relates to the second noble truth, titled How We Engage in Psychic Existence by Way of True Source being true cause. And that's so this outline is on page 415 of the text, and it has three main parts. So the first of these, which we're going through at the moment, is how delusions arise. Secondly, how karma is created independent of delusions, and thirdly, the way we die and are conceived, which is obviously based on the delusions and the karma that we create as a result. How delusions arise, that's explained in 4 parts. The outline for this is in the top of page 416, and the 4 parts here are firstly identifying the delusions, so understanding exactly what they are. Secondly, the stages in which delusions develop, which explains how delusions actually play out in our own experience day to day. Thirdly, the causes of delusions, so the specific things that lead us to experience delusions. And fourthly, the faults of delusions, so what's the problem with them? At the moment we're going through the first of these, identifying the delusions. We've talked about the fact that this section of the text firstly looks at a general definition of delusion. So it looks at the things that are characteristic of all deluded states of mind, and the thing that's generally characteristic of them, which is explained in the definition that Geshe used on page 416, is that it's a mental factor or a state of mind that when it's generated, it causes our continuum to be very unpeaceful. So causes agitation, disturbance, a feeling of discomfort. The text then goes on to look at the individual delusions, and Geshe explains that in general there's no limit to the number of delusions that exist or potentially exist, but they can be grouped into 6 main categories or 6 root delusions. And the first 5 of these are what are sometimes referred to as disturbing emotions. So here we've got things like desirous attachment, anger, pride, and so forth. And we're talking about states of mind that we're very familiar with that generally come with a strong impulse, a strong feeling, a strong emotional component, if you like. Mostly these first 5 are like that. The 6th one, deluded view, which is where we are at the moment, refers more to outlooks or ways of seeing or understanding things, and this in itself, deluded view, has being the 6th of the root delusions, itself has 5 further subpoints. Now, last week we started going through the first of these in some detail, and in going through the explanation of the first of these, we're also looking at some of the commentary, the more detailed commentary that Geshe gives in the sutra section of his great treasury of Mahamudra text. And the reason for doing that, as I explained last week, is that it's this first deluded view, the view of the transitory collection, that is the actual root of psychic existence. So understanding exactly what this is and how it works is really, really important. As we explained last week, it also has some overlap with the 4th of the root delusions, that is the delusion of ignorance. But the 4th root delusion is talking about ignorance generally, and in doing that, one of the points that Geshe makes is that, again, although there are innumerable different types of ignorance, the most significant one, or the most harmful one, is the ignorance that's confused about the true nature of self and phenomena. And this is known as the self-grasping ignorance. This first deluded view, the view of the transitory collection, is a particular instance or a particular type of this self-grasping ignorance. And here we're narrowing the focus even further. So we can say that generally self-grasping ignorance is the cause of psychic existence. If we have an even finer focus within that, the view of the transitory collection is the one that's the particular thing that we need to focus on as setting up our whole experience of psychic existence. So why are we talking about this? It sounds really technical and really difficult. Even the name is a mouthful. It sounds technical and difficult. The view of the transitory collection. What on earth is that about? Why is it really important to understand this? How is understanding all of this technical Buddhist psychological stuff really benefiting others? Doesn't seem to have a whole lot of connection with our real world problems, we might think. It's a bit like the same way that when we're a child, driving a car seems unbelievably complex and mysterious. So there are these adults who go off and do it, who do this thing. We never even think about it, and it just seems completely beyond us. And when we first start taking driving lessons, again, it seems really, really complicated. There are so many different difficult things to think about. All of this theory, all of these road rules that we need to learn, and then the first time we actually go out on the road, it is really, really scary when all of a sudden we have to put that theory into practice. But we need to understand the theory before we can put it into practice. And after, with that basis of firstly understanding and then practicing it after years and years, driving is like second nature. It's something we can almost do automatically. Similarly, suppose we want a particular type of job. So suppose we want to do nursing, for example. So to do that, to qualify as a nurse, there is so much to learn. There is so much study to do, and we really need to do it right at the time we're doing it. So we might be really inspired by the idea of nursing and of caring for people. I can actually recall Geshe saying once that if he were to come back as a layperson, so his first preference, if he were to be reincarnated, would be to be a monk and to practice Dharma. If that wasn't possible, and if he were to come back as a layperson, he would want to be a nurse, because nurses, through their job, their activities, they're most directly able to benefit people. So if we have this type of inspiration, we want to, we sincerely feel that that's our life path. The only way of becoming a good, competent nurse is to go through all of the learning, to go through all of the things that at the time that we're learning them don't seem particularly relevant or applicable to the result that we wanted. But if we don't do that, we can't achieve that result. Same way, if we really want to get rid of our root delusions, we want to be done with our anger, we want to be done with our irritation, we want to be done with our big ego, we want to be done with our clinging, desirous attachment, we can only do that by getting rid of their root cause. And we need to understand precisely what that is. Not just, and the reason that we need to understand precisely what that is that if we continue to practice, there'll come to a point where we need to look at our own mind and see this ignorance, this misunderstanding of inherent existence, the way it actually plays out in our own mind, moment to moment. And to do that, we need to know exactly what to look for and what we're looking at when we're contemplating our own mental processes. So we need to develop this very clear, precise, unmistaken understanding of how it works. Nobody's going to walk away from this class or reading this book once with that precise view. But each time we do this, each time we listen, we think, we meditate, then we get the basis of developing this actual wisdom, this actual understanding that sees the way that the mind works, and that seeing that is able to correct it. So that's why I think it's useful to go through this particular item in more detail today. So as we said last week, and so I'll go through quickly the points that we've already covered. So as we said last week, Geshe describes this view of the transitory collection as a deluded view that observes the appropriated aggregates and conceives of them as I and mine. And as we explained last week, when we're talking about the aggregates, we're talking about
our constituents, the things that comprise the person, the parts of the person. And traditionally, they're explained in terms of the five aggregates. So there are, but we don't, as we'll see in a moment, we don't specifically need to concentrate. It's not the aggregates that are themselves important. All we're looking at is the things that comprise us, the things that are the parts of the person on which we impute the person. In Path to Enlightenment, there isn't an actual definition of this deluded view, of the view of the transitory collection, but there is in Geshe Mahamudra text, Great Treasury of Mahamudra, where at page 180 he says, the definition of the view of the transitory collection is a self-grasping of the person that holds one's own self as an inherently existent self. And as we covered last week, there are a couple of important things about this. So in general, we can talk about self-grasping ignorance, the view of inherent existence as having two types. We can apply that to persons, where we see the person as being incorrectly see the person as being inherently existent, or to things other than the person. So table, building, car, so forth. The second one is self-grasping of phenomena. The actual self-grasping, the ignorance, the misunderstanding is the same, but the object is different. Here, when we're talking about the view of the transitory collection, we're only talking about self-grasping at the person. Also, there are two aspects of self-grasping of the person. So we can grasp at our own self, our own I, as being inherently existent, and we also grasp at other people, other persons, as being inherently existent. When we're talking about the view of the transitory collection, we're only talking about the first. So the view of the transitory collection is a self-grasping of the person directed at our own person. This view is partly right and it's partly wrong. What's right about it is that it perceives the I, it perceives the person that is imputed on the five aggregates. So it's right about that because there is an I that's imputed on the five aggregates. Where it's wrong, where it's mistaken or deluded, is that it views that I as having a type of existence that it doesn't actually have. Rather than conceiving it as being merely imputed, it conceives of it as having existence from its own side, from independently, in and of itself. Another way of looking at this at that same point is to ask, well, what is, so the view of the transitory collection is a view of something. What is it that it's actually viewing? So generally, again, we can take this back to basics. What does it mean to view something? So we have a view of the Buddha statue that you can see behind me. And we can think about that. So we're sitting here and we're looking at the Buddha statue. We can think about how we view it from two different points of view. Firstly, there's a referent object. So that's what our view is pointing at. Each of us, when we look at the statue, we have the same referent object. The referent object is a statue, a non-inherently existent, dependently existent statue of the Buddha that is here in this temple. If a 6-month-old baby comes in and sees the Buddha statue, the same referent object. If a cat walks in the door and looks up and sees the statue, it's the same referent object. Secondly, there is the conceived object. So the conceived object is different. We all have a slightly different concept associated with the Buddha statue. A baby that comes into the temple has none of the concept of Buddha statue that we have. So they have the same referent object, but a different conceived object. A non-Buddhist person, so a person who follows a different religious tradition or follows no religious tradition, also has a different concept, a different conceived object. A cat that comes in has a radically different conceived object. How does that work with the view of the transitory collection? We have the referent object. The referent object is this I, this mere I, that's imputed on the five aggregates. And as we said before, that's okay. The conceived object is completely haywire, because what we actually conceive when we see that object is this self that exists in and of itself inherently under its own power or independently. The referent object exists. The I exists. The conceived object does not exist. It's a complete fantasy. So it's a view of the transitory collection. What are we talking about with the word collection? What's that getting at? So the collection is the collection of the various parts that we apply the label I to. So our five aggregates, our body and mind, and so forth. So our I or ourself, it's a collection of parts. We can all reflect on ourselves. We have a body. We can see. We can experiencing our own body. We can introspect and we can see that we have a mind. Also, we can see that our body, in turn, has various parts. Our mind also has various parts, different experiences, different aspects of it. It isn't even so much that the self is a collection of the parts, it's more that the collection of the parts is the basis for labeling I, for applying self or I. The collection or the parts is what the self or the I is imputed on. So the view of the transitory collection, it's taking as its object a self, and that self is imputed on the various parts. We talk a lot about the aggregates, so earlier on in the text there's a reference to the aggregates, but that's only one way of talking about the parts of the person. There's nothing particularly magic about the aggregates in this connection. There are other ways as well that we can think about the parts of the person. And Geshe hints at this at page 423, where he says a collection refers to the collection of the parts that are the basis of the label I. So the five aggregates are included, the four elements, a classification called the 18 constituents, and so forth, or we could think about it in terms of body and mind. But one point about this is the referent object, so what it is that the view of the transitory collection views, what it's pointed at, is not just, or is not the parts, or at least it's not just the parts. And Geshe talks about this quite a bit in A Great Treasury of Mahamudra, and it's an important point. And he gives the explanation from the point of view of the different tenet schools within Indian and Tibetan Buddhism. So really briefly, the tenet schools are different philosophical schools within Indian Buddhism, and they go progressively from ones that are more basic and easier to understand to presentations that are set at the most subtle and most accurate level. And the way that they're taught or explained in Indian and Tibetan Buddhism is to help us approach the most subtle and complex views by firstly presenting an easier one. By understanding that first, that gives us the basis for understanding the more subtle ones. And progressively, as we move through the various philosophical explanations, then we can see that one explanation that seems to account for most of the things we experience, if we actually probe, we can see that it isn't complete, that it has some contradictions and some shortcomings, and that leads us step by step to the most subtle and correct philosophical view. So those four schools, the Vaibhasika school, the Sautantrika school, the Chittamatra school, and the Madhyamika school. And within the Madhyamika school, there are two divisions, the Svatantrika and the Prasangika. And it's the Prasangika view, or the consequentialist middle way school, as it's sometimes translated, that presents the highest and most accurate and most subtle view of phenomena generally. And in this case, when we're talking about the view of the transitory collection, what the middle way consequence or Prasangika school says is that what it's viewing, its referent object, isn't the aggregates. It isn't actually the parts. It isn't the it isn't in fact the things that are collected together, which we might imagine from the word view of the transitory collection. What it's actually seeing, what mental process is actually happening, is that we are perceiving the I, the mere I, that is imputed on the collection of the parts. That's the referent object. In contrast, some of the more basic schools, they just talk about the aggregates, because from that point of view, the stance is taken, well, at this stage, you don't really need to overcomplicate things. You can think about the way that your confusion works in terms of its understanding of the aggregates themselves. And that means we don't have to get into the further complexity of an I that's imputed on the aggregates. But from the point of view of actually understanding what's going on, according to the highest and most subtle point of view, what the view of the transitory collection is actually viewing is not the different parts of the collection or the collection brought together. It's the I that's imputed on the basis of that collection. Again, this sounds theoretical, but the point of understanding this is so that when we get to the point of engaging in this type of meditation itself, we're actually crystal clear about what it is we can expect to find as we investigate the nature of the I. So it's a transitory collection. What is the word transitory getting at? Well, transitory means impermanent. So what it's saying is that the various parts of the collection, that is the things that comprise us, the thing, our body, our mind, the various parts of our body and mind, they are impermanent, they're changing moment by moment. And because they are changing moment by moment, we ourselves, the I that's imputed on those parts, is also changing moment by moment. The deluded view, the view of transitory collection, sees things quite differently. So the way the view of the transitory collection experiences the I is not as this thing that has multiple parts that's changing moment by moment. We experience it as a single, permanent, partless, independent I. How does the view of the transitory collection give rise to other delusions? So once we have this fundamentalist core notion of an inherently existent, my own inherently existent I, my own inherently existent self, from that we develop a concept of inherently existent mine, or inherently existent my, as applied, for example, to my body, my feelings, my possessions, and so forth. So Geshe explains that this view of the transitory collection itself, it's got two subtypes. One of it is holding the I, the other one is holding my. But both of these, both the view holding I and the view holding my, they are both self-grasping of the person. So the second one, the view of the transitory collection holding my, isn't actually directed at objects that we own. It isn't actually a view of our possessions or of our car, our house, our body, our so forth. We certainly do have self-grasping ignorance at our possessions, at our home, our body, and so forth. But that's a self-grasping of phenomena. It's not a self-grasping of the person, and so that isn't part of the view of the transitory collection. So again, this is explained in different ways, and but summarising it, most people seem to say that what the view of the transitory collection holding my, what that's about, is a view of ourselves as an owner or as a possessor. So, for example, supposing we're sitting at the back having a cup of tea, and we've got our car keys sitting down there next to our cup of tea, and somebody else goes and picks up our car keys and gets into our car and drives off. At that moment, we have this kind of sense of ourselves as the owner of the car, and that sense of ourselves as owner of the car has been violated by this extraordinary thing that's been done to us. It's as if our self itself has been invaded or violated in that way. And it's that sense of ourselves as the owner, as the possessor, that this second type of the view of the transitory collection is getting at. It's not the view of the car that we might be attached to, it's of ourselves as the owner. So Geshe explains, again at the end of this section, which is quite brief on page 423, that this view of inherent existence of I and my, that this is actually the basis of all other delusions. And because it's the basis of all other delusions, it's also the basis of psychic existence, because it's delusions that cause us to engage in actions that create karma that produce our experience of psychic existence. So how do we go about identify? So if this view of the transitory collection, if this is the real problem, how do we go about identifying it? So that's difficult for us at the moment because the view of the transitory collection isn't one that we can simply go and identify within our own continuum. Some of our views, of course, we can identify through introspection. So if we ask ourselves, what view do I have of my brother or sister? We can think of our brother or sister and we can see what our view of them is. What view do we have of Anthony Albanese? We can introspect and see what our view of Anthony Albanese is. At present, we can't do that. We can't, by looking inwards, actually identify this view of the transitory collection because it's very, very subtle. But we can understand and observe it by meditation on emptiness, and particularly on meditation on the nature of the mind, based on having developed our wisdoms of listening, thinking, and meditation. So we understand what it is that we're actually looking at when we introspect on our mental processes. So the remaining four of the five deluded views are more like views that we could actually identify within our continuum. They're not as subtle as the view of the transitory collection, but one way or another, they're all based on the view of the transitory collection. The second one, which Geshe begins the explanation of, begins on page 423, and that's called holding an extreme view. So again, this is more like something, an explicit belief that we would have, that we would actually be able to identify within our continuum if we held it. So what this is about is we observe the I that is observed by the view of the transitory collection, that is this inherently existent I, and we hold one of two opposite views about this thing that we're conceiving. The first is that we hold this I, and that this I is in some way permanent and unchanging, and this is the extreme of permanence. So in talking about this, the Buddha was partly focused on views held by certain Indian philosophical or religious traditions at the time. In particular, the view that somehow we have an essential self that has this pure, imperishable nature, that although our body changes, although our mind changes, somehow we have this essential, permanent, core, divine nature of being that is always fundamentally the same and that doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. That's kind of the extreme of permanence. On the other hand, we can hold the extreme of nihilism. That is the view that, well, although we have this thing that looks as if it really, really exists, in fact, that's just an illusion. In fact, that's just a fabrication of our own mind. And in fact, everything is a fabrication of our own mind. Nothing truly exists. So the first of these, the extreme of permanence, it's sometimes known as the high extreme. And in a way, even though we don't hold these beliefs explicitly, or we may not hold these beliefs explicitly, based on our view of inherent existence, we all subscribe to the high extreme to some degree. The second, the view of nihilism, is the low extreme, the view that nothing exists at all, that everything, despite appearances of existing, really there's nothing there at all. And actually, of the two, it's the second that's the more destructive, because if we actually held the view that nothing existed at all, then it wouldn't matter what we did or didn't do. It wouldn't matter what our actions of body, speech, and mind were, because actually none of those things actually existed. Because those things actually do exist dependently as dependent arisings, because even though karma has not an atom of inherent existence, it nonetheless exists dependently, we do experience the results of our actions. And so therefore, of these two, the low extreme is particularly destructive, the nihilistic view. The third one is holding false views as supreme, and this relates to the previous one. So it sounds a bit as if we have this view of permanence or nihilism, and we build it into some holy religious doctrine that we become really, really attached to. So we hold on to them dogmatically as things that can't be denied, and that means that we make those deluded views even stronger. The fourth is where we hold some type of mistaken beliefs about ethical conduct or ethical practices, and we believe that practices that in fact are of no benefit to us all are going to bring us some type of liberation from suffering. So Geshe again gives examples from the Buddha's time of practices in certain philosophical schools at the time that practiced self-mutilation, believing that that was a type of practice of generosity, or practicing extreme austerity with the belief that by merely by turning the mind away from the desires of the senses, that alone would be enough to bring enlightenment. From the point of view of the Buddha, who found the middle way to practice, for something to actually be a path to liberation, it needs to counter the causes of psychic existence. The ultimate cause of psychic existence are the self-grasping ignorance, and especially the view of the transitory collection. And so a practice that actually doesn't lead to opposing the view of the transitory collection isn't going to lead to liberation. The fifth one is perverse view, and this is explained briefly as something that denies the existence of something that actually does exist, such as karma, or that affirms the existence of something that doesn't in fact exist, such as a deity that to whom a deity who will be satisfied and give us liberation by providing sacrifice to that deity. The next section then, so starting on page 426, is about the stages in which the delusions develop. And Geshe begins this by quoting Dharmakirti from his commentary on the compendium of valid cognition, where he said, by holding self, we hold other. Through self and other, attachment and aversion arise. And in connection with this, all faults arise. So here Geshe is explaining how delusions develop based on the view of the transitory collection. So the source of grasping is holding self as Dharmakirti's self. That is the basic grasping at the inherent existence of one's own self, or the view of the transitory collection. So the view of the transitory collection, it observes the self that's imputed on its parts, and it conceives that self to be permanent, independent, inherently existent. Because we see our own person, our own self as that way, other beings appear to us like that as well. And therefore, living beings who we see as helping us, as benefiting us, as helping us to get what we want, those are seen as inherently attractive from their own side. And so we develop attachment towards those living beings. Living beings who appear to be obstacles to us getting what we want, or who appear to be bringing us things that we don't want, are seen as inherently negative or inherently unattractive, and so we develop aversion to them. Living beings who we identify as neither particularly helping us nor harming us are seen as inherently uninteresting, so we develop ignorance towards them. And from those three states of mind, from attachment, aversion, and ignorance, all the other negative karmas, all delusions, all negative karmas arise. And those in turn produce all suffering of psychic existence. And again, Geshe explains this by quoting from Chandrakirti in Engaging in the Middle Way, where he said, all faults and delusions without exception can be seen to arise from the view of the transitory collection. By seeing the self that is the object of that view, a yogi refutes such a self. So the opponent to that ignorance that conceives the self as truly, permanently, and independently existent is the wisdom that that directly perceives the emptiness of inherent existence of that self. Again, even though it will take us some time, some deep experience of meditation to directly experience the self-grasping ignorance of our own person, we can see clear manifestations of it in some cases. So Geshe gives the example of the situation when somebody really rips into us, and especially if they rip into us unfairly. So if they blame us for something that in fact we haven't done, or they criticize, or they accuse us of doing something that we absolutely know that we don't do. So we have this incredibly strong, explosive reaction to this injustice that's happening. This feeling, I did not do that. How could you say that about me? And by observing our own view of the I as it emerges in those cases where it's very, very strongly stimulated, then we can start to zero in, start to understand how we view our own I, and use that as the basis for meditating on the emptiness of inherent existence of the self. And Geshe goes into a lot more detail about this in the chapter on special insight when he talks about meditating on emptiness of the person. The wisdom perceiving the emptiness of inherent existence of self, therefore, is the solution to the problem. It will overcome all of our delusions because it cuts out the base of those delusions. It cuts out the very root that they grow from. And again, Geshe illustrates this by quoting from Buddha in the Sutra on the 10 Grounds, where he says, whatever faults exist in the world arise from self-grasping. If we are free from the conception of self, there are no faults. And of course, remembering then when we're talking about being free from the conception of self, we're not talking about being free of any conception whatsoever of self. We're talking about being free of the mistaken conception of self, or the conception of self as existing truly, inherently, independently, and from its own side. When we have eliminated that ignorance, we still have a view of self, but of a merely imputedly, dependently existent self. Okay, so that's a good point to leave off since we're out of time anyway. Next week, we'll start going through the third division, that is the causes of delusions, and hopefully we'll get on to the faults of delusions. Maybe we'll be able to finish the chapter next week. Okay, so we'll finish off with final prayers. Firstly, with the final prayer of the graduated path, which we'll do in both Tibetan and English today. Deni ringdu bele tsognim kata yampa gangshe sapare lome mare kidong drowa namdren jawe wampo da gyuchik Dhammasampe tserab kuntu yang jampe yang chi tsewe jesu ne tempa rimpa kunsang lam ji cho ine drupe janam ni ji shu rangi ji shin tope lam ji ne shudra tsewe drangwe tab ke chi Doe Yichi Mompa Saljene Joe Tempa Yom Ring Sing Juche Tempa Rim Chin Chogi Ma Chabam Chab Chan Yampa Jape Chadene Yingje Chambo Yirap Chopai Pande de te sawa je pasho se che jawe me jung chun le dro jang jo lam je rim pe chang taro nam chi yu le ze shen jawe tse pa ring du chang jo che lam san tro pe tun chen drop che Gelchen selje medang me mingo. Zera kuntu jewe ngapai. Namda lamda drawa maju che. Gang se te pa chole chu chu chu. Zojin rula tsumpa de ye tse. Toren namchi tatu doji chin. Rashi jatsu jokon chabju chi. By the two collections, vast as space, amassed with effort for a long time, may I become a chief of conquerors, a guide for all beings whose mind's eye is blinded by ignorance. Also in all lives while not yet come to that, may Manjushri favour me with his compassion. Finding the supreme path, complete with all stages of the teachings, may I please the conquerors by practicing well, by my precise understanding of the essential points of the path, with skillful means drawn along by strong compassion, and by dispelling the mental darkness of beings, may I uphold the conqueror's teaching for a long time. Where the supreme precious teaching has not spread, also where it has spread but become degenerate, with a mind deeply moved by great compassion, may I make clear this treasure of benefit and bliss. The stages of the path, excellently established by the marvellous deeds of the conquerors and their sons, give glory to the minds of those aspiring for liberation. May the conqueror's deeds be long preserved. May all humans and non-humans remove the obstructions and establish conditions favourable to cultivating the excellent path, never be parted for all of their lifetimes from the purest of paths which the Buddhas have praised. When someone makes effort to practice properly the 10 points of conduct of the Supreme Vehicle, may he always be assisted by the mighty protectors, and may oceans of good fortune spread out, reaching all. And a general dedication. Gewandi che bokun sonam yeshe so sonam yeshe le jongwe tamba konyi topasho. By this virtue may all beings complete the collections of wisdom and merit, and attain the two holy bodies arisen from wisdom and merit. Jangjub Sem Chor Poche Ma Che Panam Che Ru Che Che Pa Nyamba Me sure. May the precious superior mind of enlightenment be generated in those who have not yet generated it, and not decrease in those who have developed it, but increase continuously. Okay, thanks very much. Special thanks to Manikam, and see you next week.